Hello and welcome to this online lesson. I am Mr. Hoven, and today we're going to be looking at growing tensions in the western part of the United States. If you remember back from last unit, when we were talking about westward expansion, land is continuously being added to the western half of the United States. And with that comes the problem of, does this land become slave or free? Because remember, they had to keep the balance between slave and free states in the Senate so that both sides were happy and neither side got too much power. So let's go ahead and get started. In 1819, Missouri applies for statehood, and it is applying as a slave state because many of the settlers that settled in Missouri brought their slaves with them. And this started a huge uproar in the government because at that point, 11 states were free and 11 states were slave. So Missouri coming in would upset the balance of the free and slave states. The North and the South were competing for land in the West, and even more so, their economies were different because the North was based on manufacturing and the South largely on plantations, farming, which needed slave labor. Northerners wanted to ban slavery, and Southerners, even those who disliked slavery, opposed the anti-slavery movement, or the abolitionists, because it interfered with Southerners' affairs. So after some discussion, the Senate suggested a way to resolve this crisis. Allow Missouri to join as a slave state, and admit Maine at the same time as a free state. Maine, formerly part of Massachusetts, had also applied for statehood. The Senate wanted to settle the issue of slavery in the territories for good, though. It proposed banning slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 36-degree, 30-inch north latitude line. So Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, guided the bill through the House of Representatives, which passed it very narrowly. Maine came in as a free state, Missouri is a slave state. And the 36-30 line became the line of kind of the separation. Above the line would be free, and below the line would be slave. At this point, slavery, the issue of slavery, had been averted. So there wasn't a crisis, but tensions were still rising, and would so again very soon. Tensions were again risen with the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso, and this set up a possible ban on slavery in any lands that might be acquired after the Mexican-American War. At this time, Mexico and America were at war, and some Americans thought, well, if we win the war and get land, we need to decide, should it be slave or free? So this proviso set up a way of making sure that any land gained would ban slavery. Southerners protested this, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina called for a bill which would prevent Congress to ban slavery in any new territory. Now, going through the process of becoming a law, neither bill passed, but it did spark debate. The U.S. gained California and New Mexico in 1848, but it didn't take an action on slavery in those areas, so they were kind of left in limbo. And some individuals grew so frustrated with their candidates for president that they formed their own party. In 1848, the Whig Party selected Zachary Taylor, a Southerner and a hero of the Mexican-American War, as their candidate. The Democrats chose Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan, Mr. Cass's great-great-great-great-great-uncle. Both candidates ignored the slavery issue, and this upset their voters. So, in 1848, when this was going on, opponents of slavery left their parties and created the Free Soil Party. And the goal of this party was to keep slavery out of the West. Free soil, free labor, and free men, keeping slavery out of the West. And this party was actually able to gain quite a few seats in Congress at that time. Now, the Missouri Compromise, although it did put a small band-aid on the slavery versus free state issue, it wasn't a foolproof, long-lasting solution. Because in 1849, California applied to become a free state. At this time, anti-slavery forces wanted to ban slavery in Washington, D.C., and Southerners, on the other hand, wanted a strong national law that required states to return fugitive or runaway enslaved people. They wanted a Fugitive Slave Act, or a Fugitive Slave Law. The key issue here, though, is that California applies to become a free state in 1849. This would upset the balance of power between the slave and the free states. And Southerners begin to talk about seceding or breaking away. And this is the first time murmurings of secession and breaking away from the Union had occurred. And the government knew they had to take some drastic measures in order to keep these states together. So it was up to Henry Clay, the great compromiser, the senator, to find a solution. He proposed that California come into the Union as a free state, but there is no limit on the rest of the western lands. Also, he proposed that the slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C. So that meant that there no longer could be any buying and selling of slaves in that area. And finally, Clay pushed for a stronger fugitive slave law, which allowed people to capture runaway slaves and bring them back. It also made northern people their duty, if they saw a runaway slave, to take them back to their owner. So, in the Compromise of 1850, Stephen Douglas helps out Henry Clay getting the compromise passed. California was admitted as a free state. There was no limits on slavery in the West. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., could not happen anymore. Buying and selling of slaves is outlawed. And there is now a stronger fugitive slave law known as the Fugitive Slave Act. People have to help catch runaway slaves and return them to their owners. Again, another small fix to a really big problem. So in 1854, Stephen A. Douglas, who helps Henry Clay pass the Compromise of 1850, proposed to organize the region west of Missouri and of Iowa into two territories, the Kansas and Nebraska territory. Now, he hoped his plan for the nation would be acceptable to both North and South. The location kind of would make both Kansas and Nebraska, because they're above the 36-degree 30 line, free states. But Douglas knew that Southerners would object to admitting two more free states into the Union, because it would give free states more votes in the Senate. As a result, Douglas proposed abandoning the Missouri Compromise, getting rid of it. And that every new territory should be allowed to decide if they want slavery or not through popular sovereignty. So that means people are allowed to vote. Popular sovereignty, people are allowed to vote on the issue. So people would be allowed to vote whether they wanted slavery or not in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This, again, leads to some big-time problems between Northern and Southern individuals. Many Northerners protested this bill, but Southerners backed it. And the president at the time, Franklin Pierce, backed the act as well. And in 1854, it was passed, the Kansas Nebraska Act. Slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. So that means, again, citizens in the Kansas and Nebraska territories were able to determine if their new territory or their new state was free or slave through voting, also known as popular sovereignty. Right after this law was passed, both pro- and anti-slavery groups rushed into Kansas, where elections took place. A pro-slavery legislature was elected. But here's the funny thing. Although only about 1,500 voters lived in Kansas at the time, more than 6,000 people cast ballots. Thousands of pro-slavery supporters from Missouri crossed the border just to vote in the election. These Missourians traveled in armed groups and became known as border ruffians. Soon, the new Kansas legislature passed laws supporting slavery. One law even restricted political offices to pro-slavery candidates. The anti-slavery people refused to accept these laws, and instead they armed themselves, held their own elections, and adopted a constitution that banned slavery. And at this time, Kansas had two governments, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. And this is leading to increased tensions that will break out very quickly in bloodshed. So in May 1856, 800 slavery supporters attacked the town of Lawrence, a stronghold of anti-slavery settlers. They attacked, burned the Free State Hotel, and destroyed the two newspaper offices and many homes. And after this, anti-slavery forces retaliated. John Brown, we'll hear about him a couple times, a fervent abolitionist, believed that God chose him to end slavery and strike terror in the hearts of the pro-slavery people. One night, Brown led a group of men along Pottawatomie Creek, where he seized and killed 5 supporters of slavery. Armed bands began roaming the territory of Kansas, and newspapers began to call this area Bleeding Kansas, meaning that there was so much bloodshed and blood was being spilled everywhere that because of the violence, it is now Bleeding Kansas. And violence also broke out in Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts embarrassed and lashed out against pro-slavery forces in Kansas. He criticized senators such as Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina, who supported slavery. And 2 days later, Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner with a cane. He caned him. Sumner fell to the floor unconscious and bleeding, and this incident and the Kansas feud revealed the rising hostility between the North and the South. I hope you've enjoyed this online lesson. Next time, we'll get into the causes and the beginning of the Civil War. We'll see you then.